800,000 human lives lost. That is the toll of this atrocity that occurred not so long ago in a land not so far away from where we reside today. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we will prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that this man, Augustin Bizimungu, was fully complicit in this horrendous crime. And if he were not in his position, many lives would have been saved. This man exploited his exclusive avenue of access to the armed forces to rape, torture, and kill hundreds of thousands of innocent Tutsis. Although General Bizimungu was not the only one to blame, the severity of this conflict may not have escalated into a genocide had he not been involved. Many well-organized killer groups operating under his discretion were sent out to terrorize these people day by day. These people were incredibly cold and calculated in their work. Everyday people were forced to join into these killings or be killed themselves. Today, we will hear from a victim of the genocide, who will be referred to as Jane Doe to protect her privacy. She will testify her first-hand account of what she personally experienced at the hands of the military. We will also hear from Michael Mugisha, one of the former members of the Interahamwe killer group, who will testify about his personal experience from the inside, about how these groups worked, and about the inhumane acts that went down. Using logical evidence and reasoning, we will prove this man guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. This is the only way for us to obtain any semblance of justice for the perished souls. Remember these words: silence in the face of injustice is complicity with the aggressor.
On April 6th of 1994, at about 8:30 p.m., a plane carrying, among other passengers, President of the Republic, Habyarimana, a Hutu, was shot down on its approach to the Kigali airport of Rwanda. It was an attempt at a coup constructed by the rebel Tutsis. The Tutsis began the war. Someone had to finish it. Not only bring justice to the president, but to put a stop to the years of conflict between the Tutsis and the Hutus. Rwanda was broken long before the war. This event just took it to the edge. Putting Augustin Bizimungu on trial is holding every Hutu accountable. What about the Tutsis? Aren't they just as guilty? Wasn't their plan after the coup to get rid of all the Hutus? What if they had been successful in exterminating the Hutus? Have you forgotten about the Rwandan Genocide? It is also immoral to harbor one man accountable for the death of about 600,000. The motive behind war is never to get innocent people hurt. The trial and the court's existence only exists to perpetrate a European double standard. The court not only turned a blind eye to Belgium's inhumane occupation of Rwanda, but Europe's heinous crimes across all of Africa. Dr. George is a distinguished historian and can reaffirm the fact that despite centuries of brutal colonization, slavery, and genocide by Europeans, the ICC never prosecuted a European. This trial is yet another attempt by Europe to reinforce its influence on Africa. Rather than overtly colonize Africa, they have chosen to mildly prosecute its leaders and undermine its stability.
Your Honor, I would like to present my first witness, whose name has been obscured for her privacy. Good morning. So, how old are you?
I'm 19 years old.
Could you please describe your family life before the genocide?
Yeah, so I live with my mom and dad, my older brother Freddie, my 4 younger sisters, and my 1 adopted sister in Kibuye.
Can you tell us anything about this?
Yes, so on the same day Bizimungu was promoted to Army Chief, the speech he made on April 7th, 1994, was published in the newspaper. This called for the mass killing of Tutsis. I got this copy from a friend of mine who lived in Kibuye.
How many and which members of your family perished in the genocide?
Freddie, my older brother, and I are the only 2 left.
Could you go into details about their deaths?
So right before my parents were murdered, a member of the Interahamwe from the militia asked me if I had any money to bargain with. He would give my parents a faster death, but I didn't have any money to spare. So he hacked them with a machete. The next day, My 5 sisters were thrown into a septic tank, still alive. My last memory of them are their screams as the lid of the tank closed. Freddie and I were temporarily spared because although we were ethnically Tutsi, we were both born in Burundi. The Interahamwe militia didn't know what to do.
So, you would say this is a brutal way to die?
Yes, absolutely.
What did you do after?
My brother and I had to leave because we knew they would kill us eventually. We ran bush to bush across Rwanda with little food and had to rely on hang-drying clothing from random houses for our next clean outfit.
Do you believe that this has had a lasting effect on you as a person?
My whole life has changed. Freddie and I lost everyone, our home, our right to normalcy. I was 16. I lost my childhood, my right to typical teenage adventures, my right to a mom and dad. I will never be the same person I was before.
Thank you for your testimony, and that will be all, Judge. Good morning, Mr. Michael Mugisho. How old are you?
I'm 17 years old.
Where do you come from?
I was born in Kigali and have been living there my entire life.
What did you first hear about President Habyarimana's death?
Well, on the radio, on the night of the plane crash, I heard on the radio that the Tutsis had killed our president and that they were the enemy. And we all knew about the war beforehand, but once this happened, we were all very apprehensive about it being spread throughout the whole country. So we were all very scared of it actually affecting our lives.
What sort of the violence did you see?
In Kigali, the killings broke out almost immediately. I saw men in the streets with machetes, guns, on my way home from the night shift at the gas station with my father, hunting people down. And before I was forced to join later that week, I saw pickup trucks full of Interahamwe soldiers with guns. Roadblocks were set up all over town, and there were members of the Interahamwe and the Rwandan killer group standing guard 24/7 at these roadblocks.
How did you feel about this?
As a moderate Hutu, I was just as terrified as some of the Tutsis. I knew that I would eventually be forced to join in the killings or be killed. And so when I joined the Interahamwe, the milieu was incredibly stringent. And so like everyone was joining, and in this environment, many of us came to believe that killing the Tutsis was the right thing. Because the government insisted on it, and no one said otherwise. And if you spoke out, you would have been shot.
I understand. How did you get involved with the Interahamwe?
Well, I was put in there by force. One night when me and my father were pulling into my neighborhood, there was a really loud commotion going on. There were around 10 trucks scattered throughout the neighborhood, and they were all blocking the road. So basically, we pulled over. We got out of the car and started toward my house until we realized that it was actually the Interahamwe, because we had no way of knowing that it was actually the Interahamwe. We assumed that it was actually the police. So basically, they had guns and they were grouping people by ethnicity, ordering the Tutsis to stand in the street and ordering the Hutus into their trucks. And so people's houses were being ransacked, people were being forced into the spots that the Hutus wanted them. People were getting beaten up, that kind of thing. And so basically people were being forced into where the Interahamwe wanted them. And at first I resisted, and then they beat me, leaving me with this and many bruises on my chest and legs. They shot my father on sight because they didn't really care whether he was a Hutu or Tutsi. It's just his age rendered him useless, basically. And so once each of us Hutus were in the trucks and the Tutsis were in the street, the Tutsis were all shot and we were driven away.
How was General Bizimungu involved with this?
Well, the first thing I think of is the seemingly endless lists of Tutsis that of ethnic Tutsis to be killed that he prepared for us. He referred to them as cockroaches in his letters. And I actually saw him for a few brief minutes at one of the Interahamwe business meetings. He had a few truckloads full of artillery and gasoline to help us burn houses down, that kind of thing. I remember he was wearing his light brown suit and tie adorned with dozens of colorful medals commemorating his promotions and his progress in the military. In the first days of the genocide, I remember seeing him on TV, declaring that all Tutsis were responsible for the president's death and that they were to be killed. I remember seeing his smiling face on lots of propaganda, including the television, that kind of thing.
Wow. Please go into some of the details about how these killer groups worked.
Of course, yeah. So some of us were put on roadblock duty while others went actually door to door with their guns, hunting the Tutsis down. Basically, at first, I was one of the ones who was designated to stand guard at one of the roadblocks. So I was lucky because I wasn't forced to go actually kill somebody in the first few weeks. So I saw many people get shot because they did not want to go to the roadblocks. A few of my friends were shot. Once I was late to my shift and my arm was nearly broken by one of the authorities. And so that was the same man who taught me how to fire my gun. Everything was very carefully thought out and well organized. You could easily tell that they had been planning this operation for months and months, perhaps even years before the genocide actually started. There were many organized meetings, training sessions. There were even a few parties there with drinks, that kind of thing. They were held frequently, and the official members of the Interahamwe, sorry.
Take your time, don't worry.
Yeah. So basically, the official members of the Interahamwe, they all knew each other before the genocide. They had all been working with each other for a long time. There was a clear hierarchy in the organization too. I was on the lower end of the totem pole, and I was always being told what to do, and my superiors were always threatening to beat the crap out of me if I didn't do what I was told. One week when I was appointed to one of the killer groups, we pretty much operated as if our lives depended on it, because frankly, they did. It was expected that you put in an adequate amount of effort, you killed an adequate amount of people, and that you were a general team player, There was even a sense of competition. The men who killed the most were looked at as the most brave, the most dedicated, pretty much the best members of the group. There are also small groups of people whose job was to get rid of dead bodies and to help loot the houses of the victims. Some of us were wrongly accused of actually helping the Tutsis. If it even looked like you were in any way affiliated with the Tutsis at all, you were shot. No one dared to speak out. This all contributed to a general environment of just of silence and compliance, basically. It was awful, and at that point my fear had built up so much that I couldn't think straight, and I was willing to do whatever it took to try and dial it back down.
Wow, thank you for your testimony. No further questions, Your Honor.
Good morning. You testified that you received this publication from a friend of yours, correct?
Yes.
Are you sure that this publication was not fabricated?
No, I'm not entirely sure.
Is this the only piece of evidence you have to support the prosecution of General Bizimungu?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have no further questions. Did you contribute to the Rwandan Genocide?
Yes, technically that is true.
And you did nothing to stop it?
I was not able to stop it.
Did you know about the war years before the death of President Habyarimana?
Yes.
Did you ever actually see General Bizimungu kill anyone?
Not with my own eyes, no.
So you don't know for certain if he ever actually killed someone himself?
No, technically I do not.
No further questions, Your Honor. Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness to the stand, Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans, where did you get your degree from?
I received my doctorate in social psychology from the University of Hamburg.
A copy of his degree has been provided to the prosecution. Now, Dr. Evans, does your research delve into the history of Rwanda?
Yes, quite extensively.
You talk about a cycle of humiliation in your studies. What exactly do you mean by that?
In consideration of the history of Rwanda, when given the chance, a person or community of people who have been subjugated to humiliation will become the humiliator, either against those who humiliated them or another group of people.
How does this cycle relate to the so-called Rwandan genocide?
Throughout history, it seems like the world was biased against the Hutus. In 1696, the monarch Mazimpaka claimed the Tutsi to be the shepherds because they owned so many cows, and the Rwandan economy was based on the proprietorship of cows. And everyone else, including foreigners, were Hutus. Later in the mid-1700s, Tutsi were redefined as warlike and fighting men, whereas the Hutus were defined as those who did not fight, or peasants. In the context of this time period, it meant they were weak and unworthy, and would always be below others and would always have to serve others, an enormous blow to their ego. This continued until the Belgian Imperial Empire was forced out of Rwanda during the Civil War. Many of the Tutsis disapproved of the Belgian government and were rich enough to flee from Rwanda. The Hutus stayed behind and fought for the liberation of their country and their social status. In the end, when Belgium retreated from Rwanda, the Tutsis wanted to return to their homes and the Hutus refused. They were not going to be subjugated by the Tutsis again. Embarrassed to be denied by people they thought of as their servants, the Tutsis created the RPF and attacked the Hutus.
Based on this information, did the Hutus feel under attack by the Tutsis?
Yes, absolutely.
Your Honor, I have no further questions. Members of the jury, I would like to call Dr. George to the stand. Good evening, Dr. George. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Before we get into it, Dr. George, I'd like to ask you, where'd you get your degree from?
I got my degree in history, my doctoral degree in history at Princeton University.
A copy of her doctoral degree has been provided to the prosecution. Now, Dr. George, can you explain to us what the ICC is?
Yeah, so when it comes to inhumane warfare, many of the leaders or chair people behind the atrocity aren't held liable. That's why the ICC established itself to help bear those people accountable. The ICC urges that the crimes of concern to the international community must not go unpunished.
What exactly are the crimes you can be indicted for by the ICC?
According to the ICC, global crimes include genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression.
Did the international leaders of the world come together to define the terms that the ICC determines as global crimes?
Not exactly. Most international leaders are in support of the ICC, but they didn't exactly come together and prove what the ICC determines is a global crime. To this date, 123 countries are in support of the ICC.
Is Rwanda in support of the ICC?
No.
How many African countries are in support of the ICC?
Out of 123, 33 African countries are in support of the ICC.
Is there a clear definition of war according to the ICC?
No.
So far, how many cases have been tried by the ICC in the ICC for war?
The ICC has indicted 46 people.
What are the races or nationalities of these people?
All of the individuals prosecuted by the ICC are Black and or African Arabs.
No further questions, Your Honor. What is your name?
Augustine Bizimungu.
What was your role in the Rwandan military?
I was the Army Chief of Staff.
What is your ethnicity?
I'm a Hutu, like my forefathers before me.
How has the war taken toll on Rwanda?
Rwanda has become incredibly divided, and both sides have experienced numerous deaths.
Did you mean to kill civilians?
No, we are at war. War is ugly, messy, and everything in between. These deaths were simply just a byproduct of war. I wish there was something we could have done, but just simply could not have stopped it.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Good morning. I have a couple of questions for you today. I would like to start off with this. Do you agree that the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis were mutual, not a one-sided aggression?
Yes, but we cannot deny that at the moment, the Hutus felt under attack by the Tutsis.
So since you state that it was a mutualistic aggression, do you personally believe, as a social psychology professor, that the Hutus' action of genocide was in accordance with the morality of man?
I cannot speak upon the classification of genocide. However, I believe it was a natural response to the struggles that they were experiencing at the time.
So according to what you state, you're defending the act of genocide simply because of the external pressure that they felt?
Well, it's a case-by-case basis. In this case, based on all the external factors that were at play, such as the historical prejudice and underlying conflict, there is no doubt that in the minds of the Hutus, they did what they believed was necessary.
No further questions, Your Honor. Good morning. Do you believe that the ICC is racist?
Well, it has been quite an over-representation of Black and Arab Africans that have been put on trial.
Do you believe that this has decreased the credibility of the court?
Well, there are other factors that decrease the credibility, such as the fact that global leaders don't come together as a whole and determine what was and what wasn't permitted under the ICC's jurisdiction.
However, the people who have been caught in the past have been put to justice, correct?
Yes, they were put to justice under the ICC's definition of justice.
So does the racial bias have any control over what justice is and who has been put to justice?
The disproportionate amount of Africans that have gone through the trial through this court shows the bias of the court. Other ethnicities also have war criminals, and there have been significantly less of them represented in the ICC.
No further questions, Your Honor. Good morning, General Bizimungu. As the Army Chief of Staff, were you in control of the entirety of Rwanda's armed forces?
Why, yes, I was.
So the genocide that was committed by the armed forces would be under your guidance, leadership, and discretion, correct?
What happened during the conflict was just an extension of the war. The Tutsis were the one who shot down our president. This sparked off the whole conflict, and that's why the civilians were killed. Saying that I did it on a whim would be a lie. And as we all know, when you tell a lie, you steal someone's right to the truth.
But still, these deaths that occurred, may it be a genocide or a side effect of war, was still under your leadership. Do you deny this?
Well, I wasn't the only one at fault here. There are two sides to the chain of command, yes. I was in charge of the armed forces, but I was also merely taking orders from the president, the prime minister, the rest of the cabinet, as well as the Enloe, who were all working very closely to quell the civil unrest.
I would like to ask again, and this is just a yes or no question. As the chief of staff, you were, in fact, in command of the entire armed forces, correct?
Yes.
No further questions, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we thank you for your time and attention on this case. This man that stands here is culpable of a very serious crime against humanity. We ask for a verdict of guilty. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about a man who was in possession of immense power and control over a massive military force and used this to rape and kill hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings on the basis of ethnicity. Everyday people were forced to join into the killings. Anyone who spoke out would have been killed. In my opening statement, I said that I would call two witnesses to testify against the defendant. Our witnesses, Jane Doe and Michael Mugisha, have established beyond a reasonable doubt that the atrocities of the Rwandan Genocide could have most definitely been prevented had Bizimungu not been given the power that he had. These witnesses had a first-hand account of the murders, the brutality, the killer groups, the forced labor. These stories are consistent with one another. The defense says things like this: someone had to bring justice to the president in the years of conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis. I would argue that killing each and every individual Tutsi in the country is not putting an end to the conflict. It is quite literally exacerbating it. The defense claims that its trial's sole purpose is to reinforce European influence on Africa, but it has done no research or acquired evidence to back that up. The defense claims that the Hutus are the victims, not the Tutsis, and Rwanda's history has proved marked time and time again by ethnic discriminations against the Tutsis, especially under President Habyarimana. Starting off with General Bizimungu himself. He states that he was merely following orders, but he had control over the entirety of the armed forces. Who is to tell him what to do or what not to do? He has all the power in the palm of his hand. Moving on to the historian, who makes the claim that the ICC is somehow not qualified or too biased to take this case and offer justice. This judge and jury is a mere distraction. Someone has to be brought to justice for this horrendous atrocity, and there is no other institution to do so other than the ICC. On top of which, they claim that the racial bias in the ICC shows that the institution disproportionately biases against those of African descent. This is simply untrue. It just happened to be those who are African descent were the ones that were caught by the authorities, whose prowess and skill in catching these people have nothing to do with the ICC. Lastly, with the defense's social psychologist, they have made the case that genocide is acceptable under strenuous conditions. Now answer the question, jury. Is this justifiable? Are the lives of 800,000 innocent Tutsis justifiable as collateral damage? Is it a justification to a cultural scuffle? Our defendant has every reason to lie and make excuses. He does not want to be held accountable for his actions. He still, even today, refuses and denies the fact that the genocide actually happened. So therefore, judge and jury, you must make the right verdict for the future of peace, the future of Rwanda, and the atonement of those who were killed. Thank you.
Members of the jury, as you have seen throughout this case, the accusations against Mr. Bizimungu are outrageous. What the prosecution has portrayed to be an isolated conflict is actually a long war between Hutus and Tutsis. You heard Dr. Evans speak about the extent of this conflict and how it isn't the Tutsis under the oppression of the Hutus, but actually the Hutus who have been under the oppression of the Tutsis. Mr. Bizimungu provided a first-hand account of the Tutsi crimes against him and his family, further illustrating the complexity and depth of war and crimes committed against the Tutsi. These deaths were unfortunate byproducts of a long-fought war, not an intricately detailed genocide. This case is simply another example of the ICC's overreach and bias against African nations. Dr. George has detailed the ICC's long history of bias against African nations, and you have seen the favor given from the ICC to European nations, and can see how this case is another example of this favoritism. The sheer audacity to try and hold one man accountable for the death of 600,000 people is ridiculous. Members of the jury, we hope you've seen this horrible nature of this case and can come to the correct conclusion.